Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to have Doug Tattershall to talk about Belle Brezing, who was the infamous, nationally known brothel owner, Belle Brezing. Doug Tattershall grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. He studied journalism and political science at the University of Kentucky and worked as a news reporter for the Advocate Messenger in Danville, Kentucky, before working in public relations. Today, he works as a freelance writer and media relations coordinator at the Lexington Public Library. He is the author of Belle Brezing, American Magdalene. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. So can we get started by just telling us a little bit about Belle Brezing, where she grew up, where she was born, and her early life?
Okay. Belle Brezing was a girl from Lexington, grew up probably literally on the wrong side of the tracks. We don't know exactly where her childhood home was, her first home where she was born, but there was a railroad yard and there was a sort of a skid row there that may have been where she was born. She grew up poor. She was born illegitimate, which was very much part of the status that was put on her from the very beginning that impacted her life. Her mother, she was the second daughter. Her mother had another illegitimate child before. And so when she was growing up, it was a rough life. Her mother was also a prostitute and an alcoholic. She married a man named George Brezing, who was a shop owner, owned a grocery store in Lexington, several different grocery stores in Lexington. And so she kind of lived this rough life and became even more desperate as she became a teenager, found herself on her own, found herself pregnant on her own, and after the baby was born, turned to prostitution.
To kind of support herself.
To support herself and to support her child. And ended up becoming, a very wealthy woman. Famous, her brothel ended up being this very large house in what is now Northeastern Avenue, was McGowan Street at the time, and made her way into the novel and then the movie Gone with the Wind as Belle Watling. Yeah,
so I read that she inspired that character.
Yes. John Marsh was a man, he was from Maysville, Kentucky, came to Lexington to study at UK, was a journalist, worked for the Herald and the Leader, covered the crime beat, certainly knew the story of Belle Brezing because he was here really when her house was in its heyday, right before it closed, right before World War I. He brought those stories with him to Atlanta when he moved there. He married Margaret Mitchell.
Yeah, of course.
And so that's how
it got started. So what kind of relationship did she have with her stepfather and her mother?
Well, George Brezing, whenever her mother married her, she and her sister took the name of whoever they were with. They were never adopted. So she became Belle Brezing when her mother married George Brezing. And one of the reasons that I think her story is so interesting is we know so much about it. A girl with that background, we wouldn't know much. But her mother divorced George Brezing, and there was these depositions, including her older sister's deposition about family life. And so we know something about it. The other thing is that she had a scrapbook. And so we know, we have rewards of merit that she got at school. So we know a little bit about what was on her mind as a girl. And so it's pretty remarkable to have this girl, this woman who became wealthy and famous. We don't just know the wealthy and famous part. We know a lot about her childhood, more than we normally would for a girl like that.
Because she had a recorded history, basically.
And so we know how rough it was, that there was abuse and that it was mutually abusive, the marriage was. And we know that she was we also know because she was so famous, there became this interest in a man named Joe Jordan, I believe it was, a reporter with the Herald Leader, had a book contract. And so he started doing oral history on Belle Brezing, talked to all the girls who had worked in her brothel, customers, and that sort of thing. So he began to gather some information, firsthand accounts from people who had known her. And so we know kind of the reception that she had at school because the woman who became the first female police officer in Lexington had gone to school with her.
With Belle Brezing.
And so she was able to talk about knowing as a girl that she wasn't allowed to talk to Belle Brezing, but not
because
really
of
knowing
the relation,
why.
because of the reputation.
The reputation she already, by the age of 12, was well on her way to having.
So how did she get started in the brothel business? How did she get her foot in the door, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, she at 15, she was pregnant. She married. And
the father, or
possibly
okay.
One of the people who might have been the father.
Okay.
And within 9 days, an old boyfriend was found dead outside of the back of her house.
Oh, goodness.
And there was some point, it was probably suicide.
Okay.
But somebody went out and put the gun on the man's chest, nailed the gate shut to be able to say he was never on this property. And so he had been tampered with,
basically.
And so probably by her husband. And so there was some question in the newspapers, which were far more, willing to speculate openly about things. We're saying we need, somebody needs to talk to him, and really trying to drum up the interest in this story. So he fled to Cincinnati.
He left,
and he left and never came back. He came back to Lexington, and he never came back to Belle.
Okay.
So that left her pregnant with her mother. Her husband gone.
Alone.
And so her mother, shortly after her daughter was born, died. Oh. And the story is that they went to the funeral, and when she came back with her baby, the door had been locked up. And the landlord, to her home, and the landlord had kicked her out.
Oh, goodness.
So there she looked to a neighbor to take care of her daughter, and probably pretty shortly after that was working as a prostitute. Eventually she ends up at what was kind of the premier brothel in Lexington, which was Jenny Hill's, which is the Mary Todd Lincoln house. Okay. And that's where she got her start, kind of in the open, out knowing that we can identify her firmly as a prostitute at the time. Shortly after, she opened a brothel of her own.
So interestingly, the home of Mary Todd Lincoln, where she grew up, became a brothel after.
Became a brothel, yes.
Yeah. Wow.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating, Lexington was it was much more compact. So you have a wide variety of people living a wide variety of different lives, but it all rubs elbows much more. And so you end up with Mary Todd Lincoln's house as a brothel.
Yeah. I wonder if the Todds knew that the person that purchased their home.
Yeah. Well, and the house itself has a history, because even though it's Mary Todd's childhood home, she wasn't born there, and the Todd family, I don't think, really owned that home for a real long time. I think that I think Abraham Lincoln stayed there. So it was for the expanse of her childhood into her young adulthood, certainly. But it had changed hands, and Jenny Hill didn't own it; she rented it. So a lot of things happened to that house.
Interesting. So when Belle Brezing started her own business, do we know who some of her clients were? Is there a record of it? Did she keep a good record book?
She kept a record book. It was probably coded. At least that's what some people talk about, it being coded. But there's also, now late in life, because she moved to these smaller houses on North Limestone and ended up, when there was a hue and cry about a number of brothels ending up right behind Transylvania University, that's when she moved to what was the accepted red light district, but was able to expand this house and turn it into this fabulous mansion. She did have a record book that was found and kept and supposedly ended up at UK. Wow! But it disappeared. Huh. So there's a mystery there
how that happened.
about, was even so many years later, was, the need to protect names even.
And protect people's
reputations. It was still very much a part of the culture here.
Yeah. Although there's a lot of photographs of people in her parlor.
And when they did start doing oral histories, of course, they talked to a lot of the girls. They talk to also a lot of the customers. And so you have people that are well known who went there. And, now one thing about the red light district, certainly it was prostitution.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Everybody knew.
But it also was a bar district. So you would go and you would drink and you would dance, and, whether or not you went upstairs. So when some people talk about being, well-known people talk about their experience, they don't necessarily talk about going upstairs, but they do talk about the fact that it was a social hub.
Yeah. So it was basically like you said, a social gathering place, and whether or not they made it upstairs.
Yeah. They don't always admit to that.
No. Where was her business located exactly?
She was on Magdalene at Wilson Street, which and Magdalene is now Northeastern Avenue. So kind of along Rose Lane on the north part that's been extended. That starts to go into that neighborhood.
Okay. And is the mansion still standing?
No, the mansion was auctioned off in the 1940s. In 1940, when she died, a woman bought it and opened it as a boarding house. It had all these rooms, and so that was a boarding house up until the 1970s, and then a child was playing with matches, actually, and burned it to where it was burned beyond repair, and so it was torn down in the 1970s.
Okay. How long did she run her business for?
Let's see. She was, I think, in 1870 or 1871, thereabouts. Yeah. Her large house opened in the 1890s. Okay. But she was born in 1860. I think, when she really was at Jenny Hill, she was a teenager still. Yeah. So, 1880s, she moves to North Lime. Okay. And then 1890s, she moves to her mansion.
The main house that she's more famous for.
Yeah, and that operated up until World War I.
Incredible.
And that's what really shut down kind of the red light district, but especially her house, because the city made these promises. They really wanted a camp because of the money that the soldiers coming in for training would bring. Yeah. And one of the promises they made was they were going to take care of ICE. Well, they didn't do any of it. Yeah. And so that really is what became the public scandal, and that it wasn't just kind of the winks and nudges that were happening locally. It was the federal government having a report about the vice that became known locally. Yeah.
And that became a problem?
That became the problem that the people that want the temperance movement, the prohibition, a lot of that was tied up in this movement of social hygiene, which included shutting down red light districts. So it was a different attitude that emerged over the course of the 1890s and the 1900s.
And prior to that, did the government just turn a blind eye? I mean, it was illegal.
Yeah, basically. It was. They turned a blind eye. They saw it as a necessary thing. Yeah. They wanted a red light district because they thought there was no way to stop prostitution. So we will put it in one area. Yeah. And of course, that one area tended to be the place that had poverty issues, tended to have a lot of children. So, it was kind of the place where the vulnerable were going to be, even more vulnerable because of having a red light district there. Yeah, yeah. So she was a very wealthy woman. It couldn't have been just from prostitution. I'm sure it was a prolific business, but how else did she accumulate that wealth, being able to afford such a big house and run it and pay her employees, her other prostitutes that worked out of the home? Yeah. How else did she make? She had a patron, for one thing. When she was required to move off of North Lime, she said to have gotten the patronage from a man named William Singerly. Okay. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a wealthy businessman. His father had started the rail system in Philadelphia. He had inherited, and he had started banks, and he was also a journalist. He started newspapers. So he's a wealthy man who was also an avid farmer, got interested in horses. Okay. And so he would come regularly to Kentucky. And there he met Belle Brezing. Okay. And so he became sort of her patron. So the way she was able to buy this big house and renovate and build up this big house was through his patronage. Yeah. There was a major fire in the house after several years after she had opened, but she had insurance. Okay. So she took the fire, for example, led to her adding a floor onto the thing and making it even bigger. Okay, better. So she had a way of, she really was, obviously, she had help, but she was a good businesswoman.
She was. She was like a smart woman.
Yeah. And I think she really relished, when you look at her scrapbook, there's a lot of fashion. There's a lot of, she was a very Victorian girl. She loved the sentimentality. She loved the fashion. And I think that that's why instead of just running a brothel, she ran a social hub. She loved the drinks and the socializing, the dancing, and doing it upright. Yeah, it
seemed like she liked that connection with everybody that came through her door.
And she liked it that she had the girls in good dresses. The business arrangement they had was that they had to pay so much per week. Okay. Once they had paid that amount, they could stop working. or they could continue to work and it would be their own money.
Okay.
So that was the business arrangement. I think it was maybe like $20 a week for each girl.
Yeah.
So anyway, but she loved this sort of doing it big. And I think she loved doing it big because she really wanted to get out of it. I think that she always lived with the sorrow of her childhood. And I think that's why people connect to her. She's not just, oh, look, she became famous, she became rich. There's this sense of tragedy that never leaves her life.
Yeah. Well, on that note, she did have a lot of tragedy in her life, despite her wealth and despite the choices she made, and she made those on her own. She attempted suicide twice. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened? And
well, she had, she developed a morphine problem
addiction.
that really followed her through much of especially her later life.
Okay.
She had, she lost her marriage ended.
Okay.
She lost her mother at a terrible time because it had ended. She had one of her best friends prior to that was accidentally shot to death.
Oh goodness!
And so she had that. She had the suicide attempts. She had what are some of the other things that she just throughout her life. I think there's also just the fact that it's very clear as you read, even though it's an ongoing party, she's pretty clearly an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And so, that goes with, sure, there's the party going on, but that's, always a torture because she's having to live with that.
Yeah.
Definitely, and it's supposedly later in life when she has cancer, she's addicted to morphine because of the pain, that she's still very much her experience, even the morphine is sort of just drawing out this remaining sense of tragedy in her life. So even that isn't really a comfort to her.
No. Did she have any children during her?
She had 2 children in the course of her life.
Yeah.
Daisy was born,
the first child.
And she was found to be handicapped. So she sent her to a boarding school in northern Kentucky. And when she turned 18, she went into the permanent care. It was run by nuns, so they sent her to Michigan. So she spent out her life in the care of these nuns for all of her life. And then she had another child while she was actually a madam.
Okay.
That was either stillborn or died shortly after birth.
All right.
In fact, if you look at all these photos that are collected and that are in UK's collection, she had all these photos and they gathered them up. In some cases, gathered them up out of her garbage to retrieve them.
Yeah.
So there is a picture of a baby, and I have to think that that's probably her child that was
the second
child.
Okay. How did she end her life? Basically, the last years. How did they look like? The last years of her life.
When you look at her life, you have 3 phases. You have her childhood. You have her life as a madam and as a prostitute, and then you have her seclusion life. So she closed her house probably 1917 thereabouts, and died 1940. So she lived in that house for a number of years. But it was just a closed house that was decaying eventually. Even one wall collapsed and she had to fix it. We know more about her childhood than we do about this time when she was in seclusion, which I just think is fascinating because she's the sort of person that you would not know about her childhood. We do know that. You obviously know about when she's kind of famous because she's in the news. She's a big person. People want to collect stories about when this place is operating. But then she just disappears.
Kind of disappears from the story.
Yeah, and there's very little that we know about her. The policewoman that had gone to school with her was sent there. She wanted to move, and the neighborhood did not want her to move into their neighborhood. So she was charged with kind of convincing her to stay. And so we have her account of that. So she comes in, and she's more or less spending a lot of time in bed. Yeah. And she's, not dressed for the day. She was in bed. She met the policewoman in bed. And then you also have, so you kind of see her, she is reclusive and not really, and maybe even a bit of an invalid. She's not really getting around. Yeah. She had a housekeeper. She kind of reconnected with her older sister when she closed her house. So from 17 to 1926, she's more connected to the world because of her housekeeper and because of her sister. She still has friends, girls that live in that neighborhood that she had known, that had worked for her. Yeah. But she becomes much more reclusive after her sister dies. And then, of course, she's sick. She had several years in the 30s where she had I think, cervical cancer.
Wow. Okay.
And so she spent a lot of years dealing with pain, dealing with morphine addiction.
And alcoholism.
So
why do you think her story in particular became so fascinating to people? I'm sure there was, plenty of other Mariams around Lexington. As small of a town as it is, there were others. Why was it? What was it about Belle Brezing that kind of stuck out to people that makes her so fascinating?
It was the way she did it. It was the fact that she was about being dressed in high fashion, not just herself, but her girls. It was about, better wine, better bourbon, better beer than was typical of a place like that. It was this giant house that she had. And she had three, when she opened the house, there were 3 parlors. And she said that one of her tricks was to always be able to run 3 parties without anybody knowing who else was there.
Oh, wow.
So she was adept
at
it. Yeah. So she was very adept at it. She was also smart. She also became famous. Yeah. I mean, Gone with the Wind is made her famous beyond Lexington. And so, she did it in a certain way. There were really there are other houses like that in other cities, kind of the grand brothel in the Victorian era that was just so common. But there really wasn't any place in Lexington to compare to it.
Yeah.
So she was in the red light district, and she had this 3-story house with 20 rooms. She was surrounded, and you'll see the pictures of the auction after she died. The people are surrounding this house, and you look at all the houses around it; they're just shotgun shacks.
Yeah.
And so there was no other place like that in Lexington.
So she was always carried herself in a distinguished way, despite what
and demanded that of her girls
exactly.
too, so that they had this reputation of being somehow high class.
What inspired you to research Belle Brezing?
Well, I grew up in Lexington, and I don't remember ever not knowing her name.
Okay.
But I didn't really know much about her. And I think that's how it is for a lot of people. Just, you know, and you don't really learn about it. And then I discovered that she was buried in the cemetery where my father and my son are buried. And I couldn't help but think, how does this world-famous madam end up in the Catholic cemetery? There's got to be a good story about this. Yeah. And ends up there was. So I wrote, I've always, I'm a journalist. And so I've always been writing freelance articles. And I wrote a freelance article, and I couldn't find anybody that would take it. And I thought, well, I don't want to stop because the story was so interesting and because there's so much material and it's so readily available. So I just kept looking at it. And today, one great thing about publishing is that you can publish things pretty easily. So you don't have to worry about, this has got to be a 500-page book. Because I didn't have 500 pages. So I was able to pursue it, and Win Publications was willing to publish it.
Awesome. Well, on that note, your book is called Belle Brezing, American Magdalene, and that's available for checkout at the Lexington Public Library. Thanks, Doug, for coming by and talking to us about this fascinating piece of Lexington history. Belle Brezing, American Magdalene is available for checkout and on Amazon, actually, to purchase. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.